Gary, I just appreciate you giving me the time to talk with you here. And before we get into too much and before I ask any questions, I just want to thank you for at least being willing to serve on the board. You know, whether you get elected or not is, I guess, to be seen. But it's an unpaid position and it's a public service, and I just want to thank you for that.
Sure.
Yes, sir. So I just wanted to do a little interview here so that we can give the taxing entities a little bit of an idea of who you are and where you come from and why you're running. But before I ask any questions, I just want to give you an opportunity to just tell them a little bit about yourself. And so, who is Gary Losada?
Well, that's let me start by on October 1st of this year. The City Council of Colleyville, by resolution, nominated me to serve on the TAD Board of Directors. Part of that was they saw my background on my resume and also on my testimony that I had, which I'll address in a minute. But as far as background is concerned, I guess I'm uniquely qualified compared to other candidates in that I have a master's degree from Stanford University and undergraduate degree from University of San Francisco. I served as assistant to city manager in California and assistant to the superintendent of schools in California, and then had numerous jobs in Texas, including director of administration for Dallas area rapid transit. I owned a couple of businesses that I ran on my own, and I also was in the corporate world with LTV Kentron as human resources director. I also served 6 years as the chair of various panel committees at Tarrant Appraisal Review Board. So I have an intimate awareness of what's happening at TAD and quite a bit of information of what's happening at the ARB. So that's just in a nutshell. So I turn it over to you from there.
How about that? Very good. Thank you very much. So I understand that Colleyville nominated you, but you definitely don't have to participate in this. And so I just want to know from you, like, why are you running?
Well, that's a good question. I've always been for the small guy all the way back to high school, and I just want those that are not treated as fairly, should be treated fairly. I've always been for the underdog, and quite frankly, the way things are set up right now, the taxpayer is the underdog, just because of the way some of the laws are written out of Austin, and then also just the way things are handled at TAD. So those are probably two biggest reasons up front.
Terrific. And this whole election process is fairly unknown, and people just aren't familiar with it. And it's kind of interesting that the public doesn't get an opportunity to vote. I think that the public should be aware of who's running and should be more aware of the system. But as you know, the taxing entities are the ones that actually place the votes. And so if you just want to speak directly to them, why should the taxing entities, why should the school districts and the cities vote for you?
Yes, I will speak to them. It's because I will represent the small taxing entities just as equally, in my opinion, as the larger entities who have, by the way, the largest amount of votes. Some taxing entities may have 30 votes or 60 votes, and some larger ones may have 450. And so by being a representative there, I will represent the smaller entities as well as the bigger, which ties in what I said earlier about why I'm always for the small guy.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And I know you mentioned just your passion to serve the residents here and just wanting to support the small guy. Is there anything else about that you'd like to say to the residents here in Tarrant County about why they should support you, or at least voice your support even though they can't vote?
Well, serving on the ARB for 6 years, I probably was involved with thousands, I don't even know how many, but thousands of hearings. And a lot of the times, taxpayer comes in and is not familiar with the process. And our panel always made sure that they had a fair shake and that they understood, what their rights were. And we just want to make sure, I want to make sure that that continues and that there is an attitude at TAD that they should be considered as servants of the people, and it shouldn't be the other way around. That currently doesn't exist. A lot of people are intimidated when they come into an ARB hearing. That can occur from the process itself towards individuals on the ARB or for individuals representing TAD. So there's just a lot of attitudes that should be changed so that we could be more of a serving agency and not be served. So that's probably one of the biggest things. Then there are a lot of little nuances, like there are no term limits right now on the TAD Board of Directors, and I think that's just absolutely wrong. Folks shouldn't have a lifetime ability to serve on the TAD board. I think communication between TAD and the populace should be improved. So that's another issue. Another huge issue is the ARB and TAD, and by a state code, a requirement to have a separation of those two entities. There's too much overlap. And the interesting thing about all of this is that the staff personnel that serve the ARB are actually TAD employees. So I think that creates a huge conflict. Also, I think that there's some other things about this voting process that are questionable, and how one of the top executives, maybe or more, of TAD could serve on one of the taxing entities boards and not call that a conflict of interest. I think that is a huge discrepancy that tries to skewer the voting in the favor of taxpayers against taxpayers as it relates to who would serve on the board and who wouldn't. So that I think that's an issue. I think there are conflicts of interest as it relates to maybe nepotism laws and whether or not those are enforced or not enforced or ignored or not sufficient enough. So those are many issues. Now, let me make it clear that as a member of the board of directors, I can't determine values. It's not the position of the board of directors to get in there and determine what a value is. That's between TAD and the taxpayer or the taxpayer's agent. That's the other thing as it relates to agents. I'm real big on the agents being extensions of the taxpayer. And a lot of the times that I was in hearings, TAD district employees would say, oh, so-and-so agent's coming in, and they would get into a disagreement or argument, some cases yelling matches, and I think that's totally inappropriate. So, there's just a lot of things that I can't give you all the answers to in a 10-minute, 15-minute conversation.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Well, yeah, you definitely hit on a lot of topics, and I've protested a whole bunch. I think there's so many things I'd love to talk with you about just because we share a lot of similar experiences, but that's really interesting. Well, you've gone over a whole lot. I think you've given people a lot to think about. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up here about how you might be different than the other candidates, or anything else that in particular that you're passionate about changing, or just anything else that you'd like to share?
Well, I think that's, yeah. In wrapping up, I've heard another candidate or so talk about why they would be qualified for the board, the TAD board of directors. And their comments are, well, we heard this was happening and my neighbor told me this and I heard that. Well, that's nice that you've heard that, but you've not lived it. And I lived it through thousands of hearings. So I see what's happening and what's not happening. Somebody that's running that's got that information secondhand doesn't truly understand the system, doesn't truly know how it works, and doesn't truly know how to represent a taxpayer, or for that matter, an entity. So, that is a huge advantage for me, and the public should be aware of that. The taxing entities should be aware of that. Not to just vote, I know so-and-so down the road, and he's a good guy, or he's a good public servant. That's fine. I don't begrudge anybody that. But my first question would be, how intimately involved and how knowledgeable are you about what is going on at TAD, and for that matter, the ARB? So most folks don't know that. I don't think there's probably a candidate that knows any of that information other than some of those who may have served on the board for a long period of time. And then the question I have there is, how deep and how intimate were they about that? And what was their involvement as it related to the computer debacle that occurred, and why the board was not more vocal, the board at that time, and why there were not questions. I shouldn't say that. There probably were questions asked, but how those kind of things were allowed to fester for years. And they're still not resolved, and you as an agent know that. So we still have issues there too. So there's just a lot on the plate that most people don't know about.
Very good. Well, Gary, I really appreciate you taking time out of your vacation. I know you're out of the country right now, so you've had to really rearrange your schedule and make an effort to just have this phone call. But, regardless of how the election turns out, I just want to thank you again for your willingness to serve, and thank you for your time in this interview.